What's up guys, Manny from Motomillion. In this video today, we're going to be talking about the basics of brake upgrades. And if you want some more model specific information, we're going to have those videos coming up, so look out for that. But before further ado, let's first talk about the components of a braking system on a modern superbike. The components are your front and rear brake master cylinders, your brake lines, your brake fluid, your ABS pump, your calipers, and your rotors. Let's quickly run through how the brake system works. You apply your brakes either in the front or the rear, and then the fluid, which is your brake fluid, is the hydraulic fluid, gets pushed through your lines into your ABS pump. And then from your ABS pump, that fluid will get further pushed to your calipers, which move the pistons, which squeeze your pads onto your rotors, which gives you that braking power. So in the case of the rear brakes, when you apply the rear brakes, the fluid will come up here to your ABS pump and then go down to your rear brakes and apply the rear brakes. But if some of you might know and some of you might not know, when you apply the front brakes on the modern superbikes, on most of them now, the fluid comes through to the ABS pump, but it does not get applied directly to the front caliper. It gets distributed to the front and rear caliper. Yes, most of the force has gone to the front caliper, but the rear brakes are automatically applied on these new superbikes. Now that we kind of have an understanding on how the braking works, let me take you through each component and talk to you about the basis of the upgrades that we could do. So what's in my hand is a front rotor. This is a fully floating rotor, but before we get to this, on modern superbikes and the one that's behind me, they come with a semi-floating rotor. So what is that? What's the semi-floating? What's a fully floating rotor? Well, a semi-floating rotor has the technical idea behind a fully floating rotor, but as the name suggests, it's not fully floating. If I wiggle this, it makes noise because, as the name suggests, this steel rotor ring floats on this carrier over here, which is aluminum. And it's not some David Blaine magic. It's obviously not floating in the air. It has these bobbins over here. In this case, it's the T-drive bobbins. We'll go into detail in that. But let's talk about what this floating mechanism achieves. I think the modern superbike does not come with a fully floating rotor because of the noise it makes, but I think also it's a cost measure for the companies too, because the semi-floating does a pretty good job. But what are you gaining when you run a fully floating rotor? This is mainly a track application. On the street, you do have benefits that come from using this rotor, but the floating benefits only show up on the track. And what they're trying to achieve is when this steel gets hot, there's thermal expansion. And imagine your caliper and your pads in place. If this gets hot enough and there's thermal expansion, and trust me, it does get hot enough on a racetrack, it will start deviating from the true center of the caliper, which means one, it's going to start causing drag on your pad, and it's not going to be like you're hitting the brakes, but it will slow your bike down. And two, it starts to wobble, and we get to the phenomenon what's called pad knockback. And I'm saying this is mainly only track application because if you're getting pad knockback on the street, you're probably doing things you shouldn't be doing on the street. But what is pad knockback? So this is wobbling because of thermal expansion. Obviously it's not this much, but it's enough so that those pads get pushed away by the rotor that's not being in the true center anymore. You're going to realize that, oh my God, there's no brakes because you first have to push those pads into the true center of the caliper and the rotor, and then you have to apply the brakes again so that you start braking again. And this is not a fun situation to be in. If anyone's been in this situation, you probably are going to need another change of underwear after that, but that's why these floating rotors exist. And let's get to the T-floaters versus the Super Sports that I'm holding here. So other than the colors that's evident, the T-drives come in black and the Super Sports coming in gold carriers, but also the other difference is, if you look close enough, is the bobbins. So where the rotor is attached to the carrier, this one has the T-drive, which used to be the proprietary technology that Brembo came up with throughout the racing series like MotoGP and World Superbike. And this has the traditional floaters. Again, this still makes noise and floats around, but what Brembo found out over the years with their experience was that this new T design is a better floating mechanism under thermal expansion, and it allows this to float even more. Now that we talked about the floating rotors, you're probably thinking, what is it for me in the street application on these rotors? So compared to the stock rotors, these have a thicker rotor surface over here. What does that do? It's better thermal capacity. Again, on the street, you're probably not going to get to that. Maybe on the canyon rides that you go out, this will probably help not get brake fade because it has more thermal capacity to house all of that heat that you're generating with brakes. But I think the main difference and the main benefit you'll see is the material that the steel is made from. And believe it or not, yes, it does make a difference. And this is a blend of alloys, I guess, steel alloy that they come up with that they think is the best material to be used, because when we change rotors on a bike and do not touch the pads, we do see the difference of the brake bites. And that becomes some sort of a preference of if you want something that bites better or not. But that goes to show you that this rotor is causing more friction between your pads and your rotor surface. And also, I'm gonna go a little further than just telling you guys that this makes a difference, but the material used on these rotors have to be hand selected to the degree that this will start dusting away. It's not only your pads that cause brake dust, because you are starting to get rotor shavings too, since there's friction that's happening, the rotors start wearing down. There was instances where in some racing series, the racers were going through fork seals. The dust that was being caused by the steel that was on the other brand of rotors was going on to the forks. And then with the forks going up and down, it was causing premature wear on the seals. So when you're picking your rotors or the brand names that you deal with, I think these are the things that have been thought by the engineers that engineer these products, so that you should look into these things as well. So I mentioned this only so that you guys know the level of detail of engineering that goes behind something that we just say is a front rotor. We'll briefly discuss the rear rotor, because on the modern superbikes, I already mentioned when you brake with the front brake, it does apply the rear brake. So you could run the conventional rotor that the bike has, or upgrade to a floating rotor if you want. But the most benefit that you'll see out of a road application, or even be it at a track level, is going to be lightening up that rear rotor. And guys, I'm not talking about super pro levels of MotoGP and World Superbike, because even if you look at Moto America series, they're using lightened rear rotors, because the heat capacity that they need from the rear rotor is already met enough with those lightweight rotors that you see, and such as these ones that have the pretty designs on it. So now that we talked about the rear rotors, we're going to talk about the next part. So this is a GP4 MS caliper by Brembo that I'm holding. This is a front caliper, but the whole ideas that I've been talking about also applies for the rear calipers. The same thing as we discussed with the rotor. Most of the braking happens in the front. So the most important one that you have is the front caliper, but the rear caliper is just as important. But let's first break things down. What does a caliper do? The caliper is there to hold the pistons in place, that when you apply the brakes, the brake fluid comes into your caliper, pushes the pistons in, which pushes the brake pads onto your rotors, which gives you that braking force that you're asking for. What would you want from a caliper then? You want the caliper to be as stiff as possible, because imagine when you're pulling the brakes, all that pressure is trying to deform this object that's over there. And yes, guys, believe it or not, the braking forces are enough to deform a caliper to cause it to give you the benefits or the disadvantages that is caused by that deformation. This is the stiffest road caliper that there is right now, which is available from Brembo. It's called the GP4 MS. So this being the stiffest caliper, what is it providing us? So it's providing us the better brake feel that we want, because it's not deforming. So all that brake fluid, instead of deforming the caliper with the pressure, is actually applying the brake. So what you're doing with your brake lever is correlating as directly as possible onto your pads. But by not deforming, it's also making sure that our pads are evenly wearing and are evenly being applied onto our rotors. And before we go further, let me talk about the construction of this caliper, because this is a very special caliper. This is what we call a billet monoblock caliper. What does a monoblock mean? As the name suggests, monoblock, mono means one or single, block means, in terms of the construction, it's a single piece caliper. Other than this bleeder that's here, this caliper is made from one piece of aluminum. Yes, I know the pads and the seals and also the pistons are also pieces, but the main construction of this caliper starts life as a billet piece, which is a block of aluminum that gets shaved down to this piece. And that's where the stiffness comes from, but don't be fooled that a monoblock caliper is the stiffest caliper that's out there, because for the longest time, Brembo did not have this out, and the stiffest caliper they made for the street use was their two-piece calipers, which was the GP4 RX calipers, which was a billet caliper, but their monoblock cast aluminum calipers were not as stiff. So the stiffness comes from, yes, the construction, but also the material that's being used. The calipers are also in this braking system for the heat benefits and also the dissipation of the heat. So when they design the calipers, they are trying to make sure that it's as light as possible so that it's not causing extra weight on the motorcycle, but also making sure that it's still as a stiff piece that is going to give you advantages with braking. But don't forget, on a motorcycle, the heat dissipation mostly is happening at the caliper level. So the pistons can be titanium or they could be alloys like the one that we have on here. And also there's drilled pistons. What does that mean? They drill some holes in there. So the titanium pistons will make it have a lighter weight. I think it's a very race application. Or if you're looking for that ultimate lightweight street bike, you might want to throw a set of titanium pistons on there. But also the drilled pistons are there so that they can aid with the cooling of the brake caliper by letting some air go through those pistons. Now we've made our way to the brake master cylinders. This is the front brake master cylinder. The idea behind, just like the calipers, is the same between a front brake master cylinder and a rear brake master cylinder. What is a master cylinder? It is a brake pump. In some languages, they don't even call it a master cylinder. They directly call it a brake pump. Why is that? Because this brake master cylinder is basically pumping the brake fluid through your system to have that braking happen. So why should you be upgrading your brake master cylinder, or what can you achieve with upgrading your brake master cylinder? Let's not forget, when the bikes are being built, they have budgets to meet and there's production capabilities that they have to meet. When you upgrade to a master cylinder like this, which in this case, this is an RCS 17 Corsa Corta by Brembo, what you're achieving is you're going to get better brake feel. Yes, we're talking about brake feel again. Yes, nowadays, most modern superbikes come with great master cylinders on them from the factory, that the brake feel is pretty good. But let's not forget, the brake system does get really hot, and that means that your brake fluid does get hot, and the materials that are inside of a master cylinder like this is different from an OEM one, and that heat is not going to cause any kind of adverse effects with the brake feel and the functioning of the master cylinder. And furthermore than just the heat capabilities that the materials of this have, these are constructed in a way where the tolerances are better than what you find on most OEM master cylinders, that it's going to bring you that better brake feel. So now that we're talking about the brake feel, let me also mention, you're probably wondering, what is an RCS 15, 16, 17, or 19? So that's the size of the piston that's in this master cylinder, which is pumping that brake fluid throughout your system. In most cases, when you purchase a caliper from us, there's always the Brembo recommended or the manufacturer recommended brake pump size that they want you to run. But it's not a golden rule. The manufacturers recommend running that size of the master cylinder piston because it's the optimal one that you're going to be running with that caliper, because you have to match the size of the piston that's in your master cylinder to the size that's in your calipers, which is the pistons that are making those pads go in. That being said, if you're at a level that you want to fine-tune your brake feel, you're able to do that by running maybe a smaller master cylinder, which is a 17, and when I say smaller, it's the smaller piston size that's in here, or a larger one like an RCS 19, and that's the added benefits for master cylinders that you would get. Now we get to the component that connects your master cylinder to your ABS pump to your calipers. We're talking about our brake lines. As we all might know, the brake lines are there so that the fluid can travel through the components so that the braking can take place. And as we all know, the braking system has a pressure. When you pull that lever, it's causing the pressure to go through the system, which is allowing that braking to happen. Most modern superbikes nowadays come with stainless steel braided lines. What does it mean? As the name suggests, the brake line is braided in stainless steel. And for the longest time, most bikes, almost all bikes, used to come with rubber brake lines, which was susceptible to expansion. Again, what happens when that expands? You start losing brake feel, and that's not something that you want in a braking system. You want that braking system to have as direct of a feel as possible. And we all used to upgrade to the stainless steel lines to get that optimal brake feel that we're looking for. There is now one upgrade that's available above and beyond stainless steel brake lines because of the advancements in the technology and prices of things, allowing a brake line like this to be available for you and me to use on our bikes. What are we talking about? We're talking about carbon fiber braided brake lines. The benefits are, obviously the stainless steel line is an upgrade over a rubber line, but don't forget that stainless line is expanding as well. It's just not expanding as much as the rubber line. And this carbon fiber braided brake line, yes, it's expanding, but it's not expanding nearly anywhere near a rubber line nor a stainless steel line. Just to give you the figure, if you're a numbers person watching this video, this line has a max burst pressure rate of 16,900 psi. Yes, that's 16900. If you understand that number, that is a crazy high number, which means this line can hold that much pressure inside of it. The directness of the brake feel that you get from a carbon fiber braided line might not be as drastic as having the switch from rubber to stainless, but trust me, if you're a rider that is looking for that ultimate brake feel, you do see the difference between a stainless line and a carbon fiber line. And let's take this one step further. The brake lines in the front, when you turn the wheel, they're twisting and they're routed through your forks. So there's a little bit of binding happening. This is not as much as cars where the front wheels are turning so much and your whole strut base is moving. But on motorcycles, yes, there has to be enough slack so that stuff doesn't bind, because imagine if you ever take a stainless steel line and you try to wiggle it around, it wants to stay as straight as possible. What these carbon fiber braided lines now offer is, if I may do some magic like this, I could tie a knot to this line. This has not compromised any integrity of this line, and this could be installed on a motorcycle and it's going to function just as good as if it didn't have that knot in it. The carbon fiber material that's on here, this is still in its raw form where it's not infused like carbon fiber parts that are found on a motorcycle with a resin. Because don't forget, the strength of the carbon fiber comes through the fibers and not through the resins that are being put in place. The resins are put into bodywork or other parts like that to give it the rigidity that it needs, because at the end of the day, this is a fiber, meaning it's like my shirt that is loose if you just leave it there. But when you braid it like this on a line, it gives you the advantage of being able to conform to the shapes that you want it to conform, but not lose that strength that it offers, which is the tensile strength that comes through to hold that line together in place. Now we're at the component of the braking system, which we call the magic fluid. The brake fluid is a hydraulic fluid, since it's a hydraulic system where you pull the brakes and it pushes the pistons together so that braking can happen. There's two things you should consider about when you want to change your brake fluid or upgrade the braking system of your motorcycle. Number one thing, which we all will say, is the boiling point. As we know, when you're braking, the braking system starts getting hot, so does the fluid. If you start reaching the boiling temperatures of the fluid, you're going to start losing the viscosity of that fluid, which is going to take away from that hydraulic capability that it has. And the next thing I want to mention that you should watch out for is the compressibility factor, which it gets forgotten with everyone who's considering brake fluid because it's not a talked about subject. What is compressibility? It's the ability of this fluid to withstand the pressure when you're trying to compress it. And I'm holding the HTC 64T fluid by Brembo because this is our favorite fluid, not because of the boiling point that it offers, because as we know, there are many fluids that will offer the same boiling point, but this fluid is the least compressible fluid that's out there. And this is not being said by Brembo, but it's by independent tests that have shown it. And this has been a very well kept secret for many race teams that are out there. And we're not talking about only motorcycles, but in automotive racing world. And lastly, I want to touch base quickly about some of the components that we didn't go in detail, which is the brake pads, your brake reservoir, and your master cylinder tubing. So let's dive into the pads real quick. So most of the calipers that you purchase will come with a pad on it, especially with Brembo calipers. Also, the pads that are now coming stock on modern superbikes are more than capable of withstanding everything that the road can offer and everything that the racetrack might throw at them. The pad choice is very specific, and I think you need to have experience to be able to say what you want from a pad, because the pad is your friction material and there's characteristics that are involved in it. Some pads offer more bite, some pads offer less bite. Some pads are more gradual when you're using your brakes for that bite, and some pads are more aggressive. So this is why I'm not going to go into detail. If you're a street rider, most of the pads that come stock on the bike are more than sufficient, and they offer really good feel for a wide variety of riders. But if you want to upgrade your pads, yes, there are more aggressive street pads that offer more bite that you could opt in for. And if you're a track rider, you could opt in for a very aggressive pad. But again, it's all about your riding style and what you want from pads. But let me put a disclaimer out there. If you ride on the road, you want to make sure the pad you select is a road pad, because race pads, they have a different temperature window that they operate in. You have to put heat through the pads for them to reach their optimal coefficient of friction. In short terms, it means if you go out on a cold day, your race pad might not do anything. It's just going to feel like your pads are sliding on your rotors, and it's not giving you guys braking. Brake reservoir. So the brake reservoir, as it says, it's a reservoir. It holds your brake fluid there. It does not offer anything else than a reservoir that holds your brake fluid. And if you want to upgrade it, you're upgrading it for the looks. And your tubing that connects your brake reservoir to your master cylinder is also another upgrade that you could do. Yes, it allows you to see any bubbles that are in there, or allows you to see the fluid that's in there, if it's degrading or not, by the color of it. But again, it's mainly an aesthetic upgrade that most of us street riders like to do, because let's face it, a clear tubing looks much nicer than just the black tubing that's over there. And I think that covers some of the basics of upgrading your braking system, but we will have more in-depth videos to cover the bikes like the S1000RR, M1000RR, R1, R1M, the Panigale V4 and the Street Fighter V4 upgrades that you could do on your motorcycle, and some of the stuff that's required to specifically upgrade the parts on those motorcycles. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Until next time, guys, have a great one.